Welcome, everyone. Good day. We're happy to have you here on our securityboulevard.com webinar. Today's topic is an interesting one. Love this title. So it may not be quite what you think it is, but hopefully you got some attention from the title of our webinar. Hotel hookups and video conference, a top 10 countdown to 2020's worst data breaches. So we'll have some fun with this one. Our webinar today is sponsored by Sonrai Security. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'll serve host, moderator, participant, contributor, all kinds of things, but I'm going to be joined by a really good partner here in just a moment. Some housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, and we will happily share that with everyone who attends. We'll be sending out an email to all participants with a link to the recording and to the slides as well. We're also giving away 4 Amazon gift cards, so stick around to the end of our webinar and find out if you're one of our lucky gift card winners. Now we're going to have lots of fun conversation and interesting things we'll talk about here, but we do love questions. We'd love to hear from you all throughout the presentation. That's really presentation, conversation, let's put it that way. So please put those questions into the questions tab on the GoToWebinar software, and we'll fit them into our conversation, cover them at the end, whatever we can fit in. But the point being, we really would love your participation in today's conversation. So let's move on to our topic, hotel hookups and video conference, top 10 countdown to 2020's worst data breaches. I'm joined by a very special guest, Eric Kedrosky, who is Director of Cloud Security and Research, and he's the CISO at Sonrai Security. Eric, good to have you on the webinar. Good to be with you on the webinar.
It's nice speaking to you again, Mitch.
Great to speak to you again. We've done a couple webinars together, done some Text-Wrong TV conversations. So it's good to be furthering that dialogue and focusing on some data breaches. You know, would you do us a favor? I'd love to hear some of your background, introduce yourself. I'll say a little bit about myself in just a moment. And then tell us, of course, about Sonrai Security.
Sure. Well, as Mitch said, I'm the Director of Cloud Security Research and the CISO here at Sonrai Security. You know, the way I put it is I've been doing security for almost 20 years, and I like to joke that I was doing it before it was cool and before it was popular. But this has been my career. This has been my passion. And most recently, I joined Sonrai Security, and I came from a number of CISO roles and sort of leading organizations in that respect. And what Sonrai does is we really do identity and data governance for your cloud and across all of your clouds. So we map your identity and data relationships together to show you really, you know, who your identities are, where your data is, and any risks that are associated with that. And that's really the topic of the conversation today. And I find it really fun sitting on this side of on the house now, you know, looking out, saying to other CISOs and other leaders, it's like, I know your pains, I feel your pains, I've actually been there. And, you know, I'm really excited to talk about this topic today because it is something that's really, you know, near and dear to my heart is talking about these types of things.
Just kind of live it, eat it, breathe it. It's nice just to sit back and, you know, absorb it in a different way, talk about it.
Yeah.
It's good to take a break from chasing down all those fun activities that are involved in when you're a CISO. So good to be talking with you, Eric. My name again is Mitch Ashley. I run an organization called Accelerated Strategies Group. It's actually an analyst firm that focuses on cybersecurity. We also do a great deal of work in digital transformation, cloud native kind of applications, DevOps, Agile, things like that. So very much in line with what we're talking about today. And we do all kinds of research in those areas. So it's a lot of fun. It's a great space to be in. And I, like you, Eric, this is kind of what I've done all my career. But a few more, actually quite a few more gray hairs there to show for my contributions or involvement in the industry. But it's good to be chatting about this too. So we're gonna do our. This is almost like the David Letterman late night, you know, countdown, right? We're gonna start at the top. But the top is number 10 going down to number 1. So let's talk about some of the data breaches that have happened in 2020. There's statistics, things like, you know, 9 in 10 organizations, 88% reported public cloud data loss, and particularly around the cloud during this year. You know, and of course, we've had a lot of increases of things like COVID and work from home and acceleration of digital transformation. Security is not getting easier. It's getting more challenging, and we're dealing with a lot more attacks and successful attacks from that standpoint.
I mean, if we really look at it, the move to the cloud has been progressing more forward. And if we look at 2020, it certainly was a year, that's for sure. But from the data breach perspective, I mean, we've really had some notable breaches that we're definitely going to talk about today. But I think what you're going to see is there's some real underlying, commonalities to all of these. One of them is privilege abuse. Another one is misconfigurations. And really the third is poor visibility, not having that full picture of your cloud. And it's easy to sit back and look at those three things and say, well, we've been doing security for years. Why are these things happening now? Well, with the speed, with the agility that comes with the cloud and all that power, comes new risk, comes new paradigms of doing things. And I think that's where we're seeing organizations get caught up in that, because what we see, and what I've definitely seen through the last decade in my career, is it's really easy to move to the cloud quickly, but that doesn't mean that the learning and the knowledge and all that other stuff that is needed to properly secure your cloud comes around as quickly. And so, that becomes a real problem. So I'm hoping today we can kind of shed some light on these couple of areas and really help our listeners here and our viewers, understand what they are and what they can do themselves to secure their own cloud environments.
It's interesting. Speaking about the move to the cloud acceleration over this year, 2020, some of our own research in this area said that over 60% of the people who responded, some of our research said that they had accelerated their migration to the cloud. They were already in the process, they were getting started, but they made a big push forward. So it's been an interesting year. Some people say that digital transformations have accelerated. I've seen data that shows surveys as much as 6 times as fast pace within the past 9 months. Well, I guess almost 12 months here. We're coming up on the end of the year. So let's talk about some of those misconfigurations. I mean, this is certainly an area of expertise that falls into yourself and Sonrai and the kind of technologies and products. And I know we're not going to be doing demos or talking about your products in great depth here, but love to hear, when we say misconfiguration, there's all kinds of things that can lead to a misconfiguration. How do we better define that for folks, or put some boundaries around it?
Well, I think it's really defined as the failure to implement, your security controls and some of your operational controls around any of the resources in your cloud. If you think about it, there's many, as I say, flips and switches and dials to set. And it's not just about this one and that one. It's almost like the collection of them together. And so it's the things you turn on, the things you turn off, the way that you configure them all put together really are the configuration of your cloud. But unlike your typical data center of days gone by, it's not really static either. It's always changing all the time. And so that's why these misconfigurations become such a problem.
It's interesting. Those are the kind of things you often don't know about until it's too late, right? It's just things that get overlooked or missed. And, it can be as simple as having escalated or wide open privileges to a data volume. An S3 volume living in Amazon or something like that.
And I mean, I speak about this from the vendor side. I'm sure some people are going to roll their eyes and at this, but I mean, if I come at from the CISO side of things and the experience I've had myself or with peers or with friends and colleagues, it's like, you probably do have misconfigurations in your environment. I mean, it's a given. I mean, people aren't perfect, processes aren't perfect, everything's always improving. But in the cloud, we see this more and more. And a lot of times what we hear that I didn't even know I had that problem. And I can speak firsthand to that. I know there's things that I knew were a risk, in my role before, but it wasn't until I've really started digging into it in the last couple of years to say, wow, I didn't know it was that deep, or I didn't know it was that bad, or I didn't know it impacted in that way. So it's not there to make you feel bad. It's there to make you realize, like, everybody's got these challenges, and this is why it's so important to get a get a handle on them.
It is. Well, let's dive into it a little bit further here. Going to our number 10 of our top 10 countdown, Prestige Software. So tell me a little bit more about Prestige's platform and the hotel room availability that's been used on several websites. What's happened here?
Prestige was a great platform to allow you to check the availability of hotel rooms, and was integrated to different websites and different applications. In this case, they had a breach of about 10 million files or almost 25 gigs worth of data related to their hotel guests. And this included personal PII, it included credit card data, included names and numbers and SIN numbers and all this sort of stuff that you really don't want being out there in someone else's hands. And at the end of the day, I mean, this was just a misconfigured S3 bucket, and this is something that's just been in the news forever. But that's what it was. This misconfigured S3 bucket was left open. It wasn't secured properly. It was left hanging off the internet, and this data got exposed. And this had real big negative consequences for not just Prestige and their customers, but also the business relationships that they had as well. So it was this whole overarching effect from that perspective. And then you bring in the regulations and the laws like PCI and GDPR and all these other things, and it really made this problem such a really complex one for them for something as simple as getting a configuration in an S3 bucket wrong. I mean, it was a big breach from a vulnerability that's been out there for a long time.
And they aren't the first, right? We've seen and heard of some other very notable S3 bucket configuration issues that have been entry points for data theft and other kinds of security breaches. I think one that probably also falls in the honorable mention category is Virgin Media back, I think it was in March or so, where they had a database containing, I think, 900,000 or so people that was left unsecured online. And, there was some criminal activity, of course, that happened with that breach. It's an interesting world we live in where customers, it seems like they've almost become numb to some degree to it's a breach every day. You get a new credit card. And of course, the folks who actually do get identity theft, it's a huge cost to them and can cause real damage to the business.
It sure can. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, the way I always think about this and talk about it and, put into perspective that a lot of the times there's some person at the end of this problem. We hear about an organization, we think, oh, poor organization. But if it's your information or my information or a friend's information, that's really who's getting impacted. So there's a lot of downstream effects that we don't hear about of these breaches. So when you think of millions of records, I mean, that could potentially be hundreds of thousands of people that were impacted here.
And I think your sort of average person on the street probably doesn't realize that it's not just that someone took that data and maybe they tried to use it for some nefarious purposes. That data goes on the dark web and gets sold multiple times, packaged up, and its time value over time. It's worth a lot of money initially, and over time that value decreases. But people that are stealing this data oftentimes is stealing it to sell to other people. So it's not just one attacker or group that might leverage it, but it could be dozens or more that have access to that information.
Yeah, like I explain it in this way, it's like mining for a resource. You mine for gold. Somebody goes and finds the gold. Someone goes and extracts the gold. They sell it to somebody else. It's the same thing, just in a more nefarious way. But it's at the end of the day, data is the most the most expensive commodity right now, and unfortunately, this is also one of the reasons why.
Very much so. Very much so. Well, let's jump to move on to number 9 as we kind of progress here. Let's first talk just a few things about lessons from misconfiguration before we do that. Sorry, I got ahead of myself here. So need comprehensive controls. One technique doesn't mean that you've got the bases covered. And blocking permissions with policies and constant monitoring for mistakes. Talk about these 3 sort of lessons or strategies for managing or avoiding misconfigurations.
I mean, the first thing you want to establish a baseline, right? So have a framework in place, whether it's something off the shelf like NIST or ISO or CISO or whatever it is you choose to do, have a baseline in place, and then have, ways and by which you can not just audit checkbox your configurations, but in a way you can holistically check your configurations, sort of within a scope of one area, but also in a broad area to make sure that they're all working together. But, again, the old principle in security, defense in depth. don't put all your eggs in one basket. You know, you really want to apply your controls that if one thing does change, if there is a misconfiguration in one place, that it doesn't bring down the whole house. It's not a house of cards. You want to do it so if that configuration fails, then make sure that there's compensating controls. And so as you look at your configurations, you also have to think about it in that perspective. So it's about getting the controls right, setting your baseline, but then stepping back and see how are they performing, and then how are they functioning as a group to keep you secure. You know, and one of these ones in the cloud that we always talk about these days is your identities and that identity to data relationship. You know, you really have to understand the configurations of your identities and the configurations of your data elements and your data stores to make sure that only the right people can get access to your data, and to make sure that your data is locked down, not exposed. So you have to look at in those respects as well.
You know, I think I love this. The next image, this hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. It's not just the enterprise or the business itself. It's sort of every partner, every company that you connect with, you share information with. They may have sensitive information to yours or customer information that's part of your business. It's really that network of businesses and partners and suppliers that you work with that extends the reach of potential vulnerabilities or exposures.
Yeah, like I mean, third-party data breaches are these are interesting ones, right? Because if you think about how, you know, sort of the modern business environment works, you know, you've got some rather large companies with big data sets. You tend to think, you know, the big FIs, you know, healthcare, or these big organizations. But what they do is they employ a lot of smaller companies, and a lot of these smaller companies are born in the cloud companies, offering great services to these organizations, which would then offer better products and better service to their customers. But part of that deal is that they're also taking the data of that customer, which is somebody else's data, and working with it, analyzing it, doing what they need to do with it. So, you know, you've got these organizations that now have to think about it from two perspectives. You know, the large organizations giving their data to another organization or giving access to it, you know, sure, they go through the third-party processes, but I asked the question, if these organizations are going through those third-party audit checkbox type processes, then why are there so many data breaches? I mean, obviously something's not working there. So if you're a large organization, you got to think about that. If you're an organization who's sort of sitting in the middle, working with one of these companies, now you've got this responsibility to, you know, keep your own organization safe, to safeguard the data of the organization you're using, and then finally to think about the customers. And again, it's a two-way street. I mean, you really have to know how secure you are, and make sure that overlap is secure as well. So, you know, it's really this thing that's becoming a bigger and bigger challenge. And I think that, you know, with the data breaches we're seeing, and a lot of times with those organizations in the middle, again, I come back to the point, is like something's broken there, something's not working. If people are still passing the audits but still having data breaches, it just, something's up.
I think there's some really good lessons that we're talking about now, as well as some of these other examples. Let's move down our list to number 9, KeepNet Labs, which was back in June. KeepNet's a UK security company. You know, this is a contractor exposed some data, a breach database, 5 billion records, I think it was. I don't recall exactly what the record content was. It was part of a scheduled maintenance process on the database itself. So all good intentions, right? I mean, doing things that you need to be doing, but even that can expose, you know, in the cloud, you know, through an Elasticsearch, et cetera, type of breach.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of these ones, like we just said, the classic, you know, sort of, this organization has the data of another organization, and made a mistake, or had a process that didn't work, or had a failure, you know, that exposed these records. And you know, as we'll see in the lessons from this one, it's all the same for this category.
I think, if I recall right, they disabled some security controls. Maybe it was even the firewall. You know, it's one of those, it was only down for a few minutes kind of situation. And I don't know all the details of it myself, of course. But, you know, even letting your guard down for a minute, you know, you're talking about potentially thousands of attacks that could happen with just a very short window.
So that, I mean, that's it, right? It's a simple misconfiguration, a simple sort of error a window, and someone took advantage of it really quickly.
Mhm. Some other sort of, I guess, honorable mentions in this category. Rogers, which is telecommunications cable company, and up in the Great White North, Canada,
Up here.
up in your part of the world.
Exactly.
There's probably lots of folks that we could use or learn, from as examples from this. For you, what would you say, is sort of the takeaway if we move on to the next slide, lessons from third-party breaches?
Well, I think, one of the big ones that we talked about right off the start is, as the organization giving your data, really looking at that third-party security, audit that you're doing and asking yourself, is it really comprehensive? I mean, checking a box is one thing, but you really, I think, need to be checking the controls in a much better way. Is number one, right? If you're giving your data out, you gotta do a better job of securing it. I think on the other side too, is the organization that's responsible for the data, that's taking that data, make sure that you have, you incorporate the controls you're being asked to do into your security program to ensure that the controls of your customer are actually part of your program, that you're safeguarding the data, right? Because you are going to be the target. If I'm an attacker, I'm not going to go after the large FI with the $10 million security budget. I'm going to go after the small company that probably is just chugging along and doesn't have big budgets and big staff. So you really have this bigger target on your back. So just being aware of your position in the attack chain, I guess. And lastly, it's really monitoring that least privilege, right? That least privilege, that data access. Who in your organization is accessing what data, who in the other organization might be accessing that data. And as soon as something comes up, as soon as something shifts offside, getting on top of it quickly, not just getting it buried in someone's email box or somewhere else that, a month later you find out the data went out the window.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, let's move to our next topic, weak authentication for data storage. Of course, we're securing things and there's access we need, but we need to be able to get to that data. But of course, we have to have controls around that. Let's talk about number 8, Spotify.
Yeah.
What happened in that situation here? There, I think, 350,000 some user accounts that were accessed inappropriately through some credential stuffing attacks. Not an uncommon thing. That's another thing to share. A lot of times when accounts are stolen passwords, those are stuffed. They're used through automated algorithms that stuff thousands of logins in minutes they just blast them everywhere to see. They don't know where you have an account, but they'll reuse that user ID and password to see if you've reused it. And it's a huge vulnerability.
Yeah, and I mean, in this one too, apparently that these were usernames and the credentials that were stolen as part of other data breaches, right? So that's what makes this one so interesting. That's why it hits our list. It's like, not only was this sort of this common technique used, but this data was also reused as well. So as you said, it was stolen from somewhere else, possibly sold or gotten in some way and used here. And really, when you look at weak authentication for data storages, it's like, there's ways to monitor these types of things. And if you suspect something, or even just having processes in place to be continuously sort of rotating that authentication or having different ways to secure that in place, there's a lot of things that could have been done here, I think, to avoid this one.
Really important. And I think we could take an hour just talking about password management. Let's talk about some of the lessons. Being careful, trusting old school password protection. I would define that. Start with yellow sticky notes or just reusing passwords is a fundamental no-no. Making sure you're protecting everything with authentication. 2-factor is a great thing to turn on for things where users are involved, of course. And things like zoning or controlling or segregating networks, or just access privileges across different data segments, data storage mechanisms can be a huge help to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of these areas too. Like if we're working in the cloud environment, we're looking at sort of the old school data center versus working in the cloud, where once our sort of our network form the security boundary. Well, it's not that way in the cloud anymore. You don't have this well-defined boundary. So what does form your security perimeter in the cloud is your identities, right? And identities can be users. We typically think of them as users, but in the cloud, they can be users, they can be serverless functions, they can be pieces of compute So you can see how it gets rather complex really quickly. So what you really need to do is you have to understand fundamentally, what are the identities in my cloud? First and foremost, find where they are. And then you have to say, well, what do they have permissions to do? And not what does it look like on the architecture diagram, and what does it look like on a piece of paper in the design, but the true effective permission or the end-to-end permission. Because you can get things like toxic combinations where, Mitch gets added to this group and he can do this relatively simple task. But maybe Mitch gets added to another group and that gives him some extra permissions that now he can do other things. And eventually, and we see this all the time through these toxic combinations, that everyday identities or low-level identities soon have access to a lot of resources, or even the full admin, the dreaded star through these types of things. So you really have to think about it from that perspective when working in the cloud, that the identity is the new perimeter. And again, like we say here, use proper network zoning. Also in the cloud, segment your data. Don't put it all in one place. Maybe your super sensitive data should be in its own place, protected with its own controls, and maybe some of the other stuff you don't worry about is somewhere else. So again, that way, if something gets breached over here, it's not affecting your really sensitive data.
Well, I don't know which Mitch you're talking about, but it couldn't have been me. So that's another story. So let's talk about no authentication, right? There's data that is not behind necessarily, in a database that you would typically think of that you might access. If we move on to number 7, talking about Blue Kai, that's a situation where some access was available to information that was used about tracking technology for websites and usage and things like that. And there's data stored in many, many ways that we don't necessarily think of as even personal information, but it's about users and behaviors and things that they're doing. So there can kind of be ancillary or even data exhaust that can be valuable to attackers.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't it. Like this, every time I hear of one of these ones come up, I always sort of scratch my head, and you begin to wonder, how does this happen, right? And I think one of the things, this is one of the classic things we talk about. It's like it's easy to move to the cloud, from a technology perspective, but the skills and the lessons and the processes and all that don't come as quickly. And so, as I start to dig into some of these types of breaches, you really begin to understand, like, okay, we may not know how or why I got left open, but a lot of times it's just sort of that visibility you don't have. Oh, we want to go to the cloud. One of the examples I saw once was, well, we set up this S3 bucket and we put this sort of database up there and we left it going because we wanted to transfer the data. And then they just forgot to go back and do something with it. So they had this thing to get to the cloud quickly, and then they forgot about it. And how do you forget about it? Well, you don't have the proper monitoring. You don't have the proper visibility in place to find this stuff. And that's how you get these sort of unsecured things, wide open things with no permissions hanging out there. Is probably done for a reason, but it just never was cleaned up. It just never was addressed. And these things come up more and more and more and more. This isn't the only company that it's happened to in the last year, and it probably won't be the last one either.
Well, it's often the idea of, no one will ever get access to that. There's no reason why they need it. There's no reason why it would be granted, but it happens, right? So some lessons, of course. Passwords, I would extend this to password tokens, certificates, two-factor, all kinds of things that we could do. And I would add to the list password managers. There are things that you as a dev team, an IT ops team, as an end user, there's no reason to be making up passwords that you have to be something you can type in easily, like password 12345. There's just, it's still one of the biggest easily hacked things, but I
think it comes back. Yeah, it comes back to that visibility too, right? Use your passwords, yes, but I mean, you're not going to have your DevOps people, you're not going to have your cloud ops people necessarily looking around for these things like an attacker is. They're going to move on to the next thing. So what you need is those tools, that visibility to assist them. Hey, you did this thing over here, and now you're working over there on something probably equally important, but you know what? You just left off this big risk here, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go to our next topic, the dreaded human error. Our art department went all out on this one, so I love this graphic. Fortunately, it's just gum. This guy stepping in. I assume it's a guy with work boots on there, but it's the dreaded human error. It happens all the time. So let's look at number 6, Vertafore. who, we can pick out countless situations where, this has certainly happened across many companies, even us personally. But they had disclosed their data breach, admitting that a third-party access and details. It's like 27 million Texas drivers information.
Yeah.
So it's one of those, and this is not just happened yesterday. We're talking about somewhere between March and August that it happened. So these breaches are not necessarily happened yesterday, happened last week. They can be there for years sometimes.
Yeah, and I think this one, this one doesn't need a lot of explanation. We're all humans, we're all fallible, we make mistakes. And what I always tell people about the cloud is that when you make a mistake, you can make a million of them really quickly, right? It only takes one mistake in one place. And because of the power of the cloud and automation and all these great tools, you could make a big mistake really, really, really quickly. So, this is one we don't have to drill too deep into. I think our listeners will get the point here, but this is a big one. This is at number 6. This is near the top of the list now, right?
We're working our way up. So let's talk about some of the lessons from human error. By the way, there was a previous picture of this guy where he was, okay, it was me, I did it. Now he's saying, okay, I got it fixed. So talk about some of the lessons that come from just avoiding basic human error.
The big ones are, again, in the cloud, monitoring access. Be continuously monitoring access to stuff, and not just who is what accessing it, but their permissions, the risks. Did the other Mitch, not you, Mitch, did Mitch not have access to that sensitive data this morning, but he does now? Did Mitch have the ability to not configure something, but he does now? Look at that. And really what you want to do there is and I say this in this way, you want to get to and then maintain least privilege, right? It's one thing to get there to say, yeah, we're at least privileged, but by the time you actually get those words out of your mouth, you're probably not at least privilege anymore. And that's a big challenge in the cloud. And this is where we see a lot of these human errors come in. And this will really help you to prevent that those overprivileged, those toxic combinations.
Well, let's move on to our next topic, key and secret management. I was talking before about tokens and digital certificates and things like that. WildWorks, number 5. I can't believe anybody would hack into a gaming company. We're talking about, sacrilege here. This is fun stuff. This is where we should be enjoying our time. But, it's entertainment, gaming. Any of those things are potential, places where a security breach can occur, mistake can be made. I think this one was about a game called Animal Jam. Which, by the way, isn't what's on the screen. I play that game, but that's a different topic. So, they said this broke into the systems the company uses to communicate with each other and access their secret key, so the hacker could break into the company's database. It's other sources. It's not just the database itself. It's where can they get at that information? It can be from us.
Yeah, this is one of these classic ones. We've been talking about this for years, but you see it getting more and more now when you start working again in the cloud. Things are getting faster, things are getting more automated, but you got to secure things. And we talked about this on previous slides. Use passwords, use strong passwords, use authentication, do all that stuff. But you got to manage it all too, right? It's like there's tons of this stuff out there, so you got to manage it in the right ways. I've seen organizations that say, oh yeah, we got a password manager, we just shoved everything in there, we're secure, and they walked off like they were all secure. Well, in reality, the configuration of that password manager was wrong. If one person got the right access to it, they could access all of that all of that company's customers. So it's really focusing on that and using these in the right ways and setting them up so that, again, if someone steals one key, they don't have access to your data. Someone breaks into your system, they can't access all keys. And then monitoring, and this is the big part in the cloud, monitoring what those secrets and those keys are doing. And doing that all the time and alerting you if there's any deviations from your baseline.
I have some good news in our lessons here. If we pop those up, we found Mitch. This is the Mitch that's the problem. So we'll take care of him here. So we'll talk about some of the lessons from key and secret management.
MFA is one of the big ones, right? We've been saying this for years, but again, it's amazing that either solutions aren't making it easy for MFA to be used, or people just aren't using it because they think it's cumbersome. But as I always say, if it takes what is 5 extra seconds when logging in to enter a code to a device if you're accessing sensitive data or doing a sensitive role? I really think that the time is worth it in those cases, given what we've seen that when you don't have these things in place is. Again, use keys wisely. And we just talked about this, just don't implement a password manager and walk away. Make sure you do it right. Make sure you do all that separation of duties in your keys. Make sure you have that sort of those defense in depth with your keys and with your secrets as well. And then, as always, just be looking for it all over the place. And one of the areas here is also look in your code. How many times is a key or a token or a password or something found in a piece of code in the GitHub repository and that's used? So that's a big tip right now, is look in your code to see if there's any of that secrets just hanging around ready for someone to look at in plain text and steal.
I would just to key off of this last point here, if I can do a pun, a good dad joke. When we talk about keys and PKI in particularly around keys, don't share your private key. It's amazing I have to say that. It happens. People don't realize that what that means, what you're giving away, or you really kind of have to start over once you start sharing your private key, especially if it's going into any hardware, things like that. So be careful with those. They're super important. They're just like handing somebody a password. Well, let's move to our next topic. Of course, overprivilege or escalation of privileges. Another way of saying that same kind of thing. We're going to talk about somebody who I think we all work with, know about. Talking about Cisco, a breach that they had, and there was some unauthorized access. I think one of their employees had, if I remember right, that this involved, where he had basically more access than he should have to some Google Cloud content data. So tell us a little bit about, I'm sure this has got to be something you run into a lot.
Yeah, this is one of the big things you run into a lot, especially in the cloud, is overprivileged identities. And again, as I like to say, you have to know the effective permission of your identity, not just what you think it is, not just what it's designed to be, but what it actually is at all times. Because when you see a lot of these issues come up, overprivilege or insider threat or some of the other ones we've talked about or will talk about, it always has some flavor of this, right? And it's really about, again, monitoring those identities, knowing what they are, knowing where they are, knowing what they can access, and making sure that at all times they have least privilege. And that's not easy. It's difficult. We've been dealing with this challenge for years and years and years, but it's just in the cloud, it's such a more complex thing, because at one point in time it was a user and a service account. Now it's users, now it's serverless functions, now it's pieces of compute that can all cause you issues. And as you're dealing with it and working with these things, it's really easy to overprivilege something, drop it in the wrong group, give it a bunch of permissions, use something that just sort of gets it working and walk away. And you can be creating a huge risk in your environment that's really difficult to detect and to see from end to end, and almost impossible if you're working in multi-cloud to do it all, to monitor that across your clouds as well.
Really good point. It's when you have multiple or complex environments. Let's look at some of the lessons around overprivilege. Yeah, I think this is worth spending a little bit of time on, because it is so common that it happens. And something that's woven into many of these lessons is things change. People change roles. People's responsibilities change. New players come in, players leave, et cetera, across the team. So what was appropriate at one point in time isn't necessarily the right level of access or privilege someone should have today. So just talking about adequate privilege, that's sort of a temporal thing, right?
Yeah, you really want to look at your identities and understand, what do they need to do? What's the purpose of what they're accomplishing? And design your privilege for that. But you also have to, again, consider your serverless functions and your pieces of compute, because those become identities now too. And those are actually in a lot of the cases where we see the issues come up. It's sometimes not the user identity, but maybe that piece of compute that has a role with full admin privileges. I can think of a really notorious breach from the last couple of years where this happened, right? It was an overprivileged identity that gave them access to a ton of really sensitive data. So you have to take those into context too. And as we say, we say this ad nauseum sometimes, is you really got to get to and maintain least privilege. And I emphasize the maintain. You got to be continuously monitoring both your identities and your data to make sure that those relationships, who can access what data, it's going to change. It can change over time, to make sure that anytime something, slips out of bounds, slips out of your control, or control fails, that you're notified, right away. But at the end of the day, there's just some non-technological things you can do too, and that's just process. Look for bad habits. I know sometimes in the DevOps space, one of the things that you see is like a role gets created for one application or one purpose, and it gets used by that team. And they build their little widget and they go off and they do something else, and the team gets disbanded. And now you've got this new team that's formed, and they'll say, well, hey, the role I created over there worked for me there, so I'm just going to use it over here. Well, and that thing works, but in the process of getting that thing working, did you just give this new application access to, yes, the stuff it needs, but access to stuff it doesn't need? And we're seeing that a lot, right? It's like, it worked over there, so I'm going to use it over here just to get it working and move on. So that's just a process thing. It's just making sure that these bad habits are raised as, you don't do this, and then come up with ways to make sure that you don't do this, and you create the roles that are more specific for what you need, and maybe even to the thing you need it for.
Yeah, this can also be an area of contention between security teams and maybe a development team, of course, with end users sometimes as well, because it's not always convenient to go ask for additional privileges. It can be just easier to give you more than what you need, just so you don't have to come back. But that's definitely isn't a best practice to do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's why this is a big one. I mean, this is something we could have a whole webinar on.
Yeah, no doubt, absolutely. So let's jump to an interesting topic on our list here, talking about insider threats. Our next example we're going to talk about, and by the way, I say example, there's any number of companies, ourselves probably at different points of times we could use situations like this, and we're of course not trying to make anyone look bad, but really just say, hey, these become public, and there's things that we can learn from breaches. So, I think this situation was really a couple of folks went rogue in the support staff, and basically took some customer data from merchants.
Yeah.
So it can be the people that you trust, and you also have to understand sometimes that trust can be broken by really virtually anyone. It can happen at any time, and you have to be prepared to handle when that happens, because unfortunately it does happen.
Yeah, I mean, in the media and other things, these breaches and these hacker stuff is all portrayed by these guys with hoods and running around outside your organization. But truth be told, a lot of the times the problems come from within your organization, right? From within the walls. We're inherently trusting. We want to trust our employees. We want to be people that trust, and so we go with that mindset in place. But you do have to be cognizant that not everybody is on that same page as you, and people do things for different reasons. And so looking at your insiders, in the case of Shopify here, they suffered this breach, like you said, from these two rogue members and stole their data. And the thing about insider threats is they're so difficult to detect if you don't have the right sort of tooling and processes in place. Because if this Mitch, the other Mitch we saw, the other guy there, if he's my cloud ops lead, he or she probably would have access to all this, high sensitive accounts and whatnot. So, you really need to distinguish in this case, not about maybe the identity governance, but what that identity is doing, and is it normal? Set the baseline. If that Mitch accesses that database every day at 8:30 to 9:30 to do whatever they want to do to it, or is configuring these buckets or spins up these things, you got to set that baseline. And then you got to say, well, what happens if this Mitch does it at 9 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning? So you really need to begin to baseline what your inside identities are doing, and then again look for those deviations for those identities. Because that's why this is so hard, right? Because it's our own people doing our own thing. So this is something that a lot of organizations, I think, need to put more focus to, as opposed to always just focusing on the outer walls.
Mm-hmm. some really good lessons here. I don't know how my bad hair day morning picture got in there, but credit to whoever got a hold of that. There's a lot of things, of course, we all know these best practices, things like separation of duties, that takes either multiple folks to perform some, key processes that really involve a lot of privileges or access. I think also just things like logging the activities of what's happening, right? And there's nothing wrong with doing that, because sometimes you need that, of course, for outsider threats as well. But just knowing that activities are logging when you escalate a privilege to go do some activity or make a request and it's granted for some period of time, that can be a big factor too. Just knowing there's a kind of audit trail of what's happening.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, just don't want to mess with it and get caught.
Yeah, I mean, there's some great points on the slide, and I think we've talked about a few of these, and I think a few of these, are very well known. But you brought up some really great points around logging and monitoring. It's amazing that how many times helping organizations, you go to the organization, you say, well, where's this logging to? And they're kind of like, I don't know. And it's like, well, what level logging is turned on? Well, I don't know. That's a fundamental thing that I think a lot of organizations either aren't doing sufficiently or in some cases aren't doing at all. And then protecting those logs as well. It's one thing to stick your logs somewhere, but making sure that they're protected. So that's a really big one. And then we talked about setting that baseline. So how do we know if a highly privileged or break glass account is used in a nefarious way, in an anomalous way? You have to have a baseline by which to gauge that on. How do you know if you have a segregation of duties issue? If you're not capturing that information, these are things that you can do every day to build those baselines and then look for deviations. But again, it's not always technologically focused. As I always say, it costs $1 to fix in design, it costs $10 to fix in the lab, and it costs $1,000 to fix in the field. Think about these things up front. Think about them at the start of your project. Bring the security teams in, bring your IAM teams in, bring your cloud teams in to think about these challenges up front. So when you're designing it, you're designing solutions that when you want to do these things to protect from insider threats and these identities and whatnot, that it is easy to do, or at least it's thought about, whereas opposed to tacked on at the end, and it's either very cumbersome, which people are going to not like and try to go around, or it just doesn't work, and then you're trying to basically deal with a risk as opposed to not having it at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think of logging as who's watching the watchers, right? It's sort of that analogy. Let's talk about admin credentials. What could possibly go wrong here? With what's the Spider-Man saying? With great power comes great responsibility. Of course, with admin credentials, you're talking about access to maybe the whole kingdom in some cases, but certainly you're talking about access to data, privileges. You can make changes to those type of things. The example here we're talking about was MobiFriends. I think it was an online dating site, if I remember right, but they had images and photos, usernames, personal details, a lot of things in addition to just financial data that potentially could be valuable to someone, who got access to an S3 bucket, with huge number of gigabytes of data.
Yeah, these accounts have to exist. They have to be around. You have to have administrators to do things, and your administrators are going to be, at higher privilege, but there's smart ways to do it. One of the things that I always advocated is separating them out. If you have to have 3 tiers of accounts, your day-to-day account, sort of your medium privileged account, and your really high privileged account, separate these things out, and then again, for your highly privileged ones, baseline them. Make sure that if that account gets enabled, like you don't leave them on all the times, like, we don't have dormant accounts, make sure they get enabled, the notifications go out. And I think that, when we talk about the lessons learned on this one, those are some of the big topics, right? It's separate those accounts out. And then the next thing I want to do is look for dormant accounts as well. And then the other thing is, it's again, least privilege, get to least privilege, maintain least privilege. And, I really tell a story here is that I remember, one time helping a customer out, and it's understanding the impacts of not doing these things. Sometimes I think sometimes that, we tend to forget, but we went into this organization where we were looking at what was going on, and they had a bit of an issue. and their IT staff, their operations staff were running as basically full admin, and this was in the days of the data center world, were basically running as full admin day to day. So they were running at the highest level of privilege to do their day-to-day functions. Well, of course they had a problem, because all it takes is for one account to get popped, and the account that just got popped just happened to be a domain admin.
Hmm.
So see, these are some of the areas. And as you move to the cloud, there isn't just one high level account anymore. There can be different roles, there can be different identities that have all sorts of permissions that can be used in different ways, that when you add up their effective permissions, they become overly permissive. So that's why some of these, these lessons here again are so fundamental. It's like we have to have these things. So we need to do the due diligence, the monitoring, and the processes to protect them.
I don't know if there's any good statistics or research on this, but you wonder the amount of human error that also can happen when you have that level of
Yeah,
privilege. Delete
just
something, a file or a privilege or change, and oops, that's more than it should have been. And you have a lot of power with admin credentials.
yeah, and you get into these buckets where, oh, it's just working, so I'm not going to worry about the permission that it has. Or, the other flip side of it is, oh, I just can't get this working, and we have a deliverable, and so someone comes down and says, just get it working, make it work. I don't care, make it work. What are you going to do if it's a permissions problem? 9 times out of 10, you're just going to make it overly permissive. Oh, look, it magically worked. That thing shipped, and everybody claps their hands and goes away. You just left a ticking time bomb in your environment, and those things tend to go off when you least expect them, and sometimes the blast radius is quite huge.
Yeah, what's the, I'll take the hit if something happens. No, probably not. You're gonna take the hit. So, don't just let it go, of course. So trial by fire. Let's talk about
Yes.
this next one. So Zoom, well, that's been very much in the news because, of course, we're all using Zoom and Google Meet and things like that. But Zoom has had a succession of kind of security issues, but in particular this year around data breach that involved even the FTC. So it's and you think about how much Zoom is kind of exploded onto the scene and the uses of it with schools and just our whole life. We're spending on systems like GoToWebinar or GoToMeeting and Zoom and others. Really, that now we're talking about kind of a great opportunity for information to be stolen, data to be stolen, because we use it so heavily.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of these areas where, like, in the modern times, and again, we come back to the cloud with the cloud, everybody wants to move so quickly. There's this real pressure to move quickly. And, Zoom definitely felt that pressure when the whole pandemic hit and everybody moved from the offices to remote, and they all started coming onto their service. So they needed to grow, and they needed to grow quickly. But what tends to happen in those times is sometimes security gets left behind, or security is not thought about, or you need to get that next release out the door, and security becomes a second fiddle. And that's really like putting something out there in the old adage of, oh, we'll fix it later. Well, I mean, I'm going to say something that, you talked about dad jokes. It's like, if I had $1 for every time someone told me, oh, we're going to fix that later as a security person, I wouldn't need a job anymore. Right. And it's just something that it doesn't happen. Like, how many organizations do you know that actually really fix it later? They don't. It's called technical debt, and most people are probably drowning in it. And yet you're moving forward and your processes can't keep up. So as much as this is a technology thing, it's also like a people and process thing. Data is the most expensive commodity right now. There are people 24/7 by 365 looking to get access to that data to monetize it in bad ways, not just the good ways that you are. And you have to be cognizant of that. It's almost like leaving Fort Knox unguarded because, hey, well, who's going to steal my data? Who's going to steal my gold? We're not that important. Oh, or that lock broke on that vault. Hey, we'll just fix it later. Like, it's when you contrast it, you would never do that. You would never leave your bank vault unlocked just because it broke that day. You'd have someone fix it right away, and you build processes in place, and you have the training in place to make people understand that the security thing isn't there to be the team of no, and the security thing isn't there to hold you back. It's to make sure that your business is around in 5 years. It's to make sure that your customers' data is protected. It's to make sure that your NAN's data is protected if that gets stolen as well. And so, but what we're seeing when these organizations try to move quickly, they forget about that. And they think they're managing the risk and they think they'll go back and fix it, but they don't. So many times they don't. And this is why they get caught. There's just these big holes. And, you know, a lot of these breaches we've talked about have been reported by, you know, like white hat hackers and these security research firms. Well, I mean, how many breaches aren't getting reported because they're not being found by the good guys or being found by the bad guys? Or, you know, how would you like to know about a breach? Would you rather have your internal security team say that control's broken? Or would you rather someone from the outside saying, we just stole, you know, 50 million user records, right? And you have to think about the amount of effort that goes into dealing with the someone just stole my data as opposed to finding it internally. And that's why, like, this trial by fire thing, it's like, I know we want to move fast and there are ways to do it, but you just have to prioritize security as part of the process.
Let's look at some lessons, and I think these can apply to a lot of the top 10 list. Things like continuous auditing and reporting. You know, it's something that this is where automation can be your friend. You know, shifting left, of course, building more security into applications and systems and infrastructure. Of course, whatever we can do to prevent and remediate issues. You know, there's a lot of statistics around how long vulnerabilities actually can exist, and just getting to those more quickly, closing those down makes a huge difference. And of course, you know, we don't know what we don't know, but that's not necessarily good. We still need to find out those things and use tools, of course, technology to help us with those issues.
And you know, there's two things on this. I think we've talked about a lot of these things, but there's two really big things I want to pick out about this slide. Is one, you know, integrating teams and shifting left effectively. Integrate your security and your operations teams and your applications teams together. They don't have to be silos. They can learn from each other. They can understand different perspectives. And at the end of the day, you're going to get a team that's cohesive, that works well together, and that can balance out the needs and the desires from each team to get secure products out to the market quickly. And I know for some it sounds like Valhalla, but it does happen. I have seen organizations that do this well, but like anything else you need to do well, you have to put focus to it. You have to put effort to it. And if you can do that. And then the audit point. I mean, you know, I said this all the time. I think this whole process of audit is broken. You know, we see these checkbox audits and these you know, third-party audits that say, oh yeah, you know, your data's secure, you're doing things properly, but yet we still see data breaches. And I think that, not to pick on auditors, I think that, you know, with them, what they need is they need the ability to do this continuous audit, to be not just doing a point in time audit, not to say I have 5,000 data records and I'm going to sample 500 and those are all good, so I hope the other 4,500 are good. No, you need to be looking at all times at all of your resources to make sure that they're all in bounds. And as soon as one pops out of bounds, you need to then apply remediation, you know, techniques to do that. But you can't rely on people to do that all the time. Use automation to do that. You know, if a problem comes up in your environment, don't wait for someone to look at a ticket to answer that. If you can run a piece of automation to fix that problem, run that automation in your environment to fix that problem. And I think that when you put this together and you have that continuous audit cycle on that sort of shift left, that DevOps mentality, I think, again, you can achieve your business goals and you can achieve your security goals, which is getting quality products out to the market.
Okay, I want to congratulate you on resisting the talking about your products and your company, but here's your chance. I really want to give you an opportunity to talk about Sonrai. We move on to our next slide and some of the approaches you use.
Sure. I mean, Sonrai provides a cloud security platform that we call Sonrai Dig to really, you know, map those identity and data relationships together. So all the things we kind of talked about in this podcast, what are my identities? What are their effective permissions? I mean, what can they do? What's my data? You know, where is my data and who has access to it? And monitoring that by 365. But the other thing too is it's one thing to fire off tickets and alerts, but as we just talked about, you know, adopt that shift left mentality, get those tickets, get those alerts to the teams that are going to fix the problems so that, you know, they know they're the closest to the problem to fix it. They can fix it quickly, they can fix it correctly, but it also gives them the tools to do that automation. So instead of expecting a team to go fix 5,000, you know, resources that might have been misconfigured, just run a piece of automation to do that. So that's what Sonrai leverages there.
Yeah, I mean, you've got some great technology, both uncovering, communicating where there are risks, where there are potential issues, identity, data, cloud platform risks, and also the graphing technology that you use to demonstrate the trust relationships between identities, people, system to system, things like that, data as well. Really, those are the kind of tools and information you need to be able to both find, hunt down, and address those issues.
And to be able to do it across all the clouds, not just within one. And that's the key, right? You have to have that full visibility.
Really good point. Spoken like a true CISO, Eric. Well, we're just about at the end of our time. We're literally in our last minute. So I want to take just a few seconds here to congratulate our winners of our gift cards, the folks at Media Ops that were putting on this webinar for the Sonrai team. Our winners are Curtis M., Gary S., Patrick Q., and Francis M. So you'll be contacted about how you'll receive your gift cards. And everyone who's attended, who's registered, will get an email with a link to the recording and also the slides. So Eric, it's been great doing this with you. It's been a pleasure, fun talking about this, and thanks for sharing your knowledge and experience with us too.
Thanks, Mitch, and thanks everyone else. Have a great day.
You bet. And thanks to the folks at Sonrai. Have a great day, everyone.